Hello everybody and welcome to the best loadouts for all survivors in patch 1.0 of Risk of Rain 2. This is not a comparison or ranking of each ability or survivor, rather the most optimal set or sets of abilities to use on each survivor independently. I'll have a survivor tier list coming out soon, so if you're looking for a comparison between them, I'll be on the lookout for that. Also note that while these are the most optimal skills to use, as in the ones that will perform the best in the most situations, that does not mean that you can't or shouldn't use other abilities. After all, your playstyle may very well mesh better with the skills I don't recommend, so feel free to mix and match to find out what's best for you. Alright, let's get started here with everyone's favorite doggo, Acrid. I recommend using his default abilities all across the board. While Acrid's melee abilities did receive a nice change, now granting the regenerative buff, which restores 10% of your health over half a second, this change was only a band-aid fix rather than solving the issue at large. That issue being that Acrid has no real benefit to being in melee range in the first place. Why bother leaping right into the fray versus a blazing elite, brass contraption, wandering vagrant, etc. just to get some extra healing and make that some slight healing in the grand scheme of things, when you can simply stay far away and let your secondary and special do all of the heavy lifting. In fact, by keeping a distance, you are directly reducing the amount of danger you're in and thus the HP you lose, making the regenerative buff irrelevant and making damage the only real choice between the two skill sets. If you're going into melee range, you should be rewarded with extra oomph, right? On paper, Acrid has exactly that. Neurotoxin has 240% damage versus 310% on the bite that goes all the way up to almost 1000% based on the target's HP. In reality though, you're not going to be directly on top of an enemy the entire time, all the way from 100% health to 0. That's just not going to happen. You'll have to reposition to dodge the plethora of other threats around you. You'll have to fight enemies that are in the air, so on and so forth. The consistency of the projectile far outweighs the bite's on paper benefit of having more damage, so when you're actually in the game, the projectile ends up being much more useful. There's a similar reason here for his utilities as well. The default leap has less damage but a much shorter cooldown, making it a far better option to use for defensive or mobility reasons. Using your leap for combat purposes past the first few stages is just asking to get yourself annihilated. And to quickly address poison versus blight, this relationship was untouched on patch 1.0, meaning poison is still the better choice due to the consistency. Acrid just does not have enough tools available to maintain high stacks of blight, save for if you grab a purity, but at that point, why not get the best of both worlds by simply relying on bleeds as your stackable damage and keeping poison to chunk the high HP targets on top of that. Plus, poison actually deals the greater value between 1% of the target's HP or 100% of your damage per second, making it an effective tool even versus those low HP enemies as well. Sure, it can't land the finishing blow, but once you get a single gasoline, ukulele, any damaging equipment, let alone just using your special to wipe groups out, the non-lethal tag is a non-issue. Moving on to Artificer, I recommend either her Nano Bomb or Ice Spear with everything else default. Flame Bolt far surpasses the usefulness of Plasma Bolt with its higher damage due to the ignite effect, and the slightly increased blast radius of Plasma Bolt is not enough to warrant its use. While Ion Surge does have its uses, especially with the always airborne gameplay style, I simply find the damage output of Flamethrower to be of more use. By trading it for the jump, you are giving up a lot of your early game damage and a decent amount later on, but yes, this is less of an issue as time goes on, so Ion Surge isn't a terrible choice if you're okay with that early game trade-off. Finally, her bomb received a nice damage increase, going from 1200% top end to 2000, which you would think would turn it into a no-brainer better choice. However, the bomb also received the addition of being affected by gravity, making landing shots longer than close to medium distance far less consistent than before. That, coupled with the fact that the spear executes enemies under 35% HP, makes the choice more of personal preference than anything. I prefer the spear due to the freeze, execute, and piercing mechanics, but the bomb is also a viable option with its larger AoE and higher direct damage. Moving on to Captain, I recommend running double hacking beacon, however, you can kinda do whatever you want. Is this because each beacon is close enough to one another in power to make them viable each in their own scenarios? No. Well, yes, that is true, but no, that's not the reason why I'm saying to take whatever you want. It's because the beacons are the least important ability in Captain's kit, to the point where I rarely find using them past the first few stages. Captain's special is more of a, oh yeah, I forgot I had these things, rather than a, oh man, I really need to use this beacon here. I find the hacking beacon to be the most useful due to the amount of time it saves you early on by bypassing 2 chant shrines, large chests, and such. This matters quite a bit for your run as a whole when so much is determined by those early game choices. However, if you find yourself needing extra support in combat, which I really don't see how you would when playing the Captain, but let's just go with it here, then sure, take a healing, shocking, or supply beacon as well. Don't keep yourself away awake at night, stressing over which beacon to take, however, because Captain's got enough oomph in the rest of his kit to cover all of the bases. Moving on to Commando, I recommend his alternate secondary, alternate utility, and default special. Phase Blast is a straight upgrade over Phase Round, 1600% damage at short range versus 300%, but with the ability to pierce and travel longer distances. Yeah, not worth it in any situation. If you have Phase Blast unlocked, use it. If you don't, unlock it as soon as you can. Roll versus slide is a bit of personal preference, but once you get used to the slide jump, which is literally just you pressing your jump key after sliding, there really isn't any reason to go back to the roll. You get the height of a jump with the distance of the roll, all packaged neatly into the slide itself. Finally, the frag grenades have their uses, sure, but the inability to deal with flying enemies is not worth the trade-off of dealing slightly more damage to things on the ground, especially because Phase Blast performs that exact same job. It's worth noting that frag grenades are the only way Commando can proc fire and ice band without additional items, but again, that's not a good enough reason to take it over the much higher consistency and scaling of suppressive fire. Moving on to Engineer, I recommend his alternate secondary, alternate utility, and either special. Spider Mines are to the Engineer what Phase Blast is to the Commando. Once you have them, there is no reason to go back to the default version again. They are a straight upgrade, needing no time to arm and have a much higher consistency due to chasing down enemies rather than sitting idly by. The utility is personal preference. I personally place no value on an effect that relies on you standing still or in a small area, because in this game, movement is so important to staying alive, so I take the harpoons. Do you need to stand completely still to make use of the shield? No, but again, that area confines you within such a small range that as soon as an Eldamarian or brass contraption comes through the barrier, and trust me, they will come through, you may as well have been standing still due to the whooping that you're about to receive. The bubble shield is useful to toss down quickly to block incoming shots or to place around your turrets to give them some brief respite to the onslaught, but neither are enough of a reason to lose out on the damage and overall mobility that the harpoons give in comparison. Finally, your turret choice is completely personal preference. If you like holding down specific zones for elongated periods of time, such as when you farm for the legendary chest on Abyssal Depths, then by all means take the stationary turrets and, bungus. Otherwise, if you like to stay on the move, the mobile turrets are a solid option as well, albeit with slightly less overall DPS due to them following you around and not being locked down to the same spot. Moving on to the Huntress, I recommend either primary, alternate utility, and alternate special. If you plan on fighting the final boss specifically on stage 5, or if you want to obliterate once you reach stage 8, then Strafe is an excellent option as it has a much higher attack rate as well as damage per shot, making it more useful as a primary attack early on. If, however, your goal is to go as long as possible in your run, then Flurry is the better choice, no doubt. It starts off pretty weak, but receives double the benefit from critical strikes, firing twice the amount of arrows and still dealing the double damage as usual, so as soon as you reach about 30% crit chance, you'll start to feel the power. There is no guarantee that you get a decent amount of crit before the final boss or obliteration, which is why I recommend Strafe, but again, if you're simply playing to go as far as possible, then Flurry is the better choice. Single versus triple blink. Yeah, it's safe to say that I have been converted. Single blink is a 7-second cooldown, while triple is 2 and can store up to 3 charges to use at a time. Yes, you do lose out on vertical movement capabilities by dropping single blink, but you more than make up for this, especially once you get a Hopu Feather, due to the much higher uptime of the triple blink. Even after just a couple goat hooves or energy drinks, it'll be as if you're blinking the same exact distance, but with a significantly shorter cooldown. If you've been on the ropes at all, it is time to come over to the triple blink master race. Finally, Ballista gives Huntress some much needed single target damage, and the small AoE that Arrow Rain gives is not worth that trade-off, especially when Glaive already handles groups of enemies with ease. Moving on to Loader, I recommend her alternate secondary and either utility. The alternate grapple is another no-brainer upgrade. It deals damage, stuns, and pull things to you, all while keeping the same exact cooldown and effect as the regular grapple. Calling the ability to be pulled to lesser wisps and brass contraptions instead of smacking them right into your robot punches a benefit, which is the only reason to take the default grapple, is not accurate in the slightest. However, Loader's utilities are a different story. If you like zooming through your enemies and holding your punches for more accuracy, then taking the default utility is your best bet. However, if you enjoy the immediacy of throwing out the punch as well as sticking on top of your targets, take Thunder Punch instead. Thunder also comes with some nice AoE sprinkled on top, but the trade-off is dealing less single hit damage, which I personally find that to be worth it. Again, both punches are viable options depending on your playstyle. Moving on to to Mercenary. He's a bit of an oddball on this patch. I recommend to simply do whatever the heck you want. I've played with every combination of his kit, and honestly, I can't feel much of a difference in his playstyle regardless of the loadout I'm running. There are benefits and issues with every single ability, and none really feel necessary to Mercenary's identity, which I guess is a good thing because that was Hopu's whole goal with the loadouts in the first place. For his secondary, Whirlwind keeps you on target better at the loss of less single hit damage, while Rising Thunder deals more damage but is harder to spam due to constantly pushing you airborne. For specials, Eviscerate gives you some much needed iframes, a period where you're immune to all damage, but at the cost of 1 being a melee ability, and 2 not applying the exposed debuff, which when you hit an exposed enemy, it reduces all of your cooldowns by 1 second and adds 350% base damage to the hit, consuming the debuff in the process. Slicing Winds does deal less damage overall due to not scaling with attack speed, but does expose targets, so such a trade-off is less relevant, especially when you consider the ranged capability. All in all, you can make arguments to use every single ability on Mercenary in his current state, which again is not a bad thing at all, just different from what it used to be. Moving on to MUL-T, I recommend either a nail gun and rebar, nail gun and scrap launcher, or double rebar. Nail gun is definitely MUL-T's most consistent ability at close to medium range, making it an invaluable tool at his disposal. However, both rebar and scrap launcher receive some nice buffs with patch 1.0, rebar having its wind up move to the end of the attack, making it an instant shot, and scrap turning into a rocket launcher with no bullet drop rather than firing grenades with a huge arc. Taking either of them with a nail gun is what I have found to have the best results. However, yes, there is an argument to be made for double rebar puncher. Now, I don't think this combo is nearly as busted as some people do, but to say it's not strong or viable would be a lie. Again, rebar now fires instantaneously with a slight delay happening after the shot comes out, and this, coupled with MUL-T special going from a 0.7 to 0.4 cooldown, means that you can grab double rebar, hold down both your primary and special buttons, and have them fire for 600% damage every 0.4 seconds like clockwork. Again, I've used this combo in a few runs and do not find it to be drastically better or really any better at all than simply taking 1 rebar paired with a nail gun. Try it for yourself and see if you can manage holding like 4 buttons simultaneously while strafing and firing with this silly combo. Otherwise, just stick to the good old default MUL-T loadout of nail gun, rebar. Finally, for Rex, I recommend his default secondary and alternate utility. The icons are swapped in the game to reflect his robot abilities on one side and the plant ones on the other, so that's why they're both on the same side here. Seed Barrage has no cooldown and is only gated behind the 0.5 second local cooldown that all abilities share, making its consistency and overall damage output far higher than that of Directive Drill. Not spending your health to use an ability is a plus, sure, but with Rex having so much innate healing in the kit, not to mention once you get some healing related items, it is not worth the large difference in damage output. For utilities, Bramble Volley deals some damage, heals per target hit, and knocks enemies back. The only difference between the two abilities is that the default Directive Disperse also applies Rex's Weaken passive, which reduces enemy movement speed, damage, and armor. However, his primary applies the same debuff, and you'll be holding that puppy down for literally the entire time you're in combat, so the debuff application is not a valid reason to choose Disperse over Bramble. The amount of healing that Bramble provides can come in clutch when you're at dangerously low HP levels, and its damage is just icing on the cake. And that does it for the best loadouts on all survivors. What are your thoughts? Do you want to let me know how OP Drill is with a couple backup mags? Let me know with a like or dislike on the video and a comment below. You can check out my stream at twitch.tv/Woolie Gaming and consider joining our Discord server as well. Thank you for watching, and be on the lookout for my Survivor tier list coming here within the next few days.